Chapter 42. "You see much?" Boyson whispered up from below. Kelin looked down. "I see a lot. Nothing of Dare, Jacob, or Carrick, though." He leaned against the metal support halfway up the windmill. Where could they be? He still couldn't believe that he hadn't noticed when they'd gotten separated in their mad dash away from the cave. Just suddenly, he had been running with only Feenan, Boyson, Striggle, and Thalin. He tore through his memories but had no idea when they'd broken up as a unit. Was it when they'd fallen into the ravine? Overhead, the giant blades of the windmill hung unmoving. It was much bigger than any mill he'd ever seen. His father's back in Riversbridge was water-powered and used to grind flour. This one had massive chains disappearing into the ground below. He guessed it was probably a type of well, but he had no idea how deep the water would have to be to demand this construction. Around him, he could see the forest, the city, and the endless patchwork of farmlands. Dry ditches led away from the mill and into the fields, where other massive mills dotted the landscape. A perfect square of irrigation channels divided each field. But none of the windmills were turning, and Kelin couldn't find any plants higher than his knees. He wasn't sure if they were green or not, but he doubted it. They looked too dry. He thought of the forest, where the leaves had hardly grown and the trees were withering. He gripped the steel frame so hard that several of his fingernails bent back. No one could last here. Not for much longer, anyway. Dark rain was rotting underneath the Kemen's identical boots. They had killed their world. He swung his head toward the city, and Zazakorma opened up like a split belly. The capital was constructed of squares. The streets marched in straight lines, like these fields, intersecting at every corner. Kellen's eyes watered. He had never seen anything like that. He was used to winding, curling streets that followed the paths of cows long gone. The villages and towns had grown up around them. He'd never imagined a city that had been planned. The rectangular buildings were anything but frightening. It didn't ring true with the ancient horrors of the Kemen. And that made it worse because he knew exactly what the Kemen would do to a prisoner. He tightened his jaw. He had seen and felt their horrors, and now he had seen they'd killed their world. He let his gaze drift over to the fields. If they concentrated on farming as much as they did on war, they could probably coax their world back into growth. But they'd built swords instead of plows. Shuddering, he found himself thankful the Kemen had given up their humanity. This way he didn't have to call them cousins. His foot felt down the metal until it reached a hold, and he eased himself toward the ground. "See things? Good," Boyson said encouragingly. Beside him, Striggle nodded. Behind them, Thalin was playing with some twigs in the soil. "Yeah, I saw a lot of things." He turned to Feenan. "I saw that you should have killed every last one back in the old war." He dove right through the elf's gasp. "But you couldn't do it, could you?" The dwarves shrugged, but they likely hadn't been able to keep up with Kellen's burst of speed. Feenan clapped a hand over his open mouth. "You don't understand. Life is sacred. Sending them here was giving ourselves and them a chance. And look at what they did with it." Kelin stalked forward, pointing toward the direction of the city. "Shh, shh." Boyson waved his hands down. The young man continued staring at the elf. "Your life isn't sacred to them. Not yours, not mine, not even little Thalin's. That's why they're back, because you played by your code of honor when the Kemen had no such thing. Look at what they did to their world. Look at it." The elf raised his hand as if to slap him. Instead, he growled and jerked to the side. He exhaled and unclenched his hands. "I have no answer. Every solution that would provide us with peace breaks my beliefs." Kelin watched as the elf let his gaze settle to the distance. The human cleared his throat and said, "There's no water here. No signs of Dare, Jacob, or Carrick either." "No here, no here," Striggle motioned, pushing something away. "Move." Feenan tilted his head to the side and nodded. "Yes, Master Dwarf, we should move. He started walking through one of the irrigation ditches. Kelin and the dwarves followed, but the human turned around when he realized Thalin hadn't moved. The boy remained sitting.
Is Dad back yet?
Kelin shook his head. No, and we don't know how to find him or the others. He offered down his hand and helped the child to stand. Go! Boyson pointed away from where they were standing. Finan bowed his head. I agree. We need to escape. The others are on their own.
No!
Thalin exploded.
We have to find Dad!
Finan knelt in front of the boy. Sir Jacob was right. It is your safety that we fear for, my child. That's why we must flee. Your father is the most likely to survive, but he can't do it with us surrounding him. Do you understand?
No.
Thalin quivered.
Are you mad at him?
The elf stood and sighed. Out? Striggle asked. Finan nodded. There are other thin spots. We just have to find one.
Won't the Kemen guard the others?
Thalin inquired. Probably. Kelin said, We can hope that the guard isn't heavy, but they know we're here. The elf snipped off a developing smile. Well, I must say that you've certainly taken up the sword since your friend has gone missing. He shrugged. Someone has to do it. Finan nodded. We ought to find a road that seems to be well-traveled and watch. The Kemen must be going to Earth routinely this far into their assault, so we should be able to locate at least one thin spot they're using. We can only hope it's by a tree path or near allies. That's more cautious than I'm used to. Kelin paused. I like it. As they crouched and walked through the ditches, he realized that he wasn't noticing how the grass and the dirt weren't brown. He had finally adapted to an environment without color. He recalled something Donley's father, the village forester, had told him back in Riversbridge. A man could not be self-aware while sneaking or hiding. No thoughts, no breath. A man was not a conscious thing. It was best to think of yourself as a rock or a tree. He'd meant it for hunting, though, not for tiptoeing through enemy territory. He felt himself shiver at the thought. He missed home. The people back in the village didn't believe in the existence of the Kemen, and here he was, in their domain, trying to end a war. He slithered around one of the sharp corners where two ditches met and nearly toppled over a storm reader. His head snapped up. It looked to be a patrol of 5 or 6 soldiers. Both parties stared in amazement at each other. Finan snatched Thalin up in his arms as he whirled to run. The dwarves kept up, their shorter legs pumping twice as fast. Kelin was the last to wheel around and sprint away. He was sure he felt blades licking his back. He urged his feet to fly, his knees to keep up, and his head to outrun them all.